turn to the subject of the lecture, and I remind you of the title, which may be slightly puzzling to you, but I hope to explain before long what it means. It is Race, the Floating Signifier. I want, at what you might think a rather late stage in the game, to return to the question of what we might mean by saying. What are the implications of saying, as I've done in a rather provocative title to this lecture, that race is a discursive construct, that it's a sliding signifier. Statements of this kind have acquired a certain status in advanced critical circles these days, but it's very clear that critics and theorists don't always mean the same thing or draw the same inference from the statement when they make it. What's more, the idea that race might be described as a signifier is not one which, in my experience, has penetrated very deeply into or done very effectively the work of unhinging and dislodging what I would call common sense assumptions and everyday ways of talking about race and of making sense about race in our society today. And I'm really talking in part about that great, untidy, dirty world in which race matters outside of the academy, as well as what light we may throw on it from inside. More seriously, the dislocating effects on the world of political mobilization around issues of race and racism, the dislocating effects on the strategies of anti-racist politics and education of thinking of race as a signifier have not been adequately charted or assessed. Well, you may not be persuaded by the story yet, but that's my excuse for returning at this late date to a topic about which I know many people feel that, after all that can usefully be said about race has already been said. What do I mean by a floating signifier? Well, to put it crudely, race is one of those major concepts which organize the great classificatory systems of difference which operate in human societies. And to say that race is a discursive category recognizes that all attempts to ground this concept scientifically, to locate differences between the races on what one might call scientific, biological, or genetic grounds, have been largely shown to be untenable. We must therefore, it said, substitute a socio-historical or cultural definition of race for the biological one. As the philosopher Anthony Appiah once put it succinctly in his now renowned and elegantly argued contribution in a book which I think many of you will know. It's the critical inquiry book called Race, Writing, and Difference, edited by Henry Louis Gates. He argues that it's time, as it were, that the biological concept of race was sunk without trace. As we know, human genetic variability between different populations, normally assigned to a racial category, is not significantly greater than it is within those populations. And what W.E.B. Du Bois, who is a great African-American thinker and writer on these questions, a figure not necessarily known in the United Kingdom as well as he should be, who wrote a wonderfully moving text called The Souls of Black Folks. Well, what Du Bois argues in his essay called The Conservation of Races, what he called the differences of color, hair, and bone. Though, as he observed, and I quote, clearly defined to the eye of the historian and the sociologist, which is a good thing because there are lots of things sociologists don't see, but he thought that racial difference was something they might just make out. That such things are, on the whole, poorly correlated with genetic difference, and on the other hand, impossible to correlate significantly with cultural, intellectual, or the cognitive characteristics of a people, quite apart from being subject to extraordinary variation within any one family, let alone within any one so-called family of races. I want to note 4 things at once about this general position. First, it represents the by now common and conventional wisdom amongst leading scientists in the field. Second, the fact that this view, which is enshrined by the hand of a very great French anthropologist, Lévi-Strauss, in the founding documents of UNESCO, that fact has never prevented intense scholarly activity being devoted by a minority of committed academics to attempting to prove a correlation between racially defined genetic characteristics and cultural performance. In other words, we are not dealing with a field in which, as it were, the scientifically and rationally established fact prevents scientists from continuing to try to prove the opposite. Thirdly, I observe that though the racialized implications of this continuing scientific work into, for example, race and intelligence, are vociferously refused and condemned by large numbers of people, certainly by most liberal professionals, and especially by black groups of all kinds, in fact, a great deal of what is said by such groups amongst themselves is predicated precisely on some such assumption, i.e., that some social, political, or cultural phenomenon, like the rightness of a political line, or the merits of a literary and musical production, or the correctness of an attitude or belief, can be traced to and explained by, and especially fixed and guaranteed in its truth by the racial character of the person involved. I refer to this as the intense but not neglected, though as yet unsuccessful quest for what one might call the baseball or the reggae gene. One of these days, I feel, I'm going to open the THES and it's going to be said that at last the baseball gene has been discovered. I deduce from this intense scholarly activity that the awkward lesson that diametrically opposed political positions can often be derived from the same philosophical argument. And that though the genetic explanation of social and cultural behavior is often denounced as racist, the genetic, biological, and physiological definitions of race are alive and well in the common sense discourses of us all. This is the paradoxical finding which I want to explore and address in what follows. Why should this be so? Now, the problem with moving to a socio-historical or cultural definition of race from a genetic or biological one is, as Anthony Appiah, the philosopher to whom I referred before, clearly understands, what to do about this biological trace that remains active in racial discourse. If I can briefly remind you in truncated form of what his argument was, and it's a long and sophisticated one, but I want to get to the nub of it, he argues that Du Bois called his own life story the autobiography of a race concept. But that Du Bois gradually, though never completely, came to acknowledge the unbiological nature of races. Whilst recognizing in an essay called The Conservation of Races that the subtle, delicate, and elusive differences which have separated men into groups, men and women I expect he meant, into groups, have sometimes followed the natural cleavage of common blood, descent, and physical peculiarities which we call race, they have, he remarks, at other times, swept across and ignored these distinctions. The divisions into races, which we persist in making, he says, therefore perhaps transcend scientific definition. However, Appiah argues that this recognition by Du Bois only partially transcends what he calls the biological trace, since, and I quote, if Du Bois had fully transcended the scientific notion, what is this talk about common blood doing in what he says, which is nothing else but the notion of common blood, the old biological fact dressed up in fancy clothes. Not only do I agree with that reading of Du Bois's struggle, unsuccessful struggle to get rid of the biological notion of race, I also note how symptomatic it is of the whole discourse about race, the fact that the biological, physiological, or genetic definition, having been shown out the front door, tends to sidle around the veranda and climb back in through the window. In an article in Crisis of August 1911, we find Du Bois moving decisively towards writing, and I quote, "of civilizations where we can now speak of races," adding that even the physical characteristics, including skin color, are to no small extent the direct result of the physical and social environment. In addition to being too indefinite and too elusive, he says, to serve as a basis for any origin, classification, or division of human groups. Now, on the basis of this recognition in Dusk of Dawn, Du Bois abandons the scientific definition of race in favor of the fact that, he's writing about Africans, that Africans and people of African descent have what he calls a common racial ancestry because, important to note this, they have a common history, have suffered a common disaster, and have one long memory of disaster. Because color, though of little meaning in itself, is really important, Du Bois argues, as a badge for the social heritage of slavery, the dissemination and the insult of that experience, unquote. A badge, a token, a sign. Here indeed is the idea hinted at in the title of my talk that race is a signifier, and that racialized behavior and difference needs to be understood as a discursive, not necessarily as a genetic or biological fact. I don't want to deviate here with a long theoretical disquisition about the terms that I'm using, which would bore you to tears. I simply want to remind you that the model being proposed here is closer to that of how a language works than of how our biologies or our physiologies work. That race is more like a language than it is like the way in which we are biologically constituted. You may think that's an absurd and ridiculous thing to say. You may even now be surreptitiously glancing around the room just to make sure that your visual appearances are in full working order. I assure you they are. People do look rather peculiar. Some of them are brown, some of them are quite black. Some of you are pretty brown, some of you are really disgustingly pink in the current light. But there's nothing wrong with your appearances, but I want to insist to you that nevertheless, the argument I want to make to you is that race works like a language. And signifiers refer to the systems and concepts of the classification of a culture, to its making meaning practices. And those things gain their meaning not because of what they contain in their essence, but in the shifting relations of difference which they establish with other concepts and ideas in a signifying field. Their meaning, because it is relational and not essential, can never be finally fixed, but is subject to the constant process of redefinition and appropriation, to the losing of old meanings and the appropriation and collection and contracting of new ones, to the endless process of being constantly re-signified, made to mean something different in different cultures, in different historical formations, at different moments of time. The meaning of a signifier can never be finally or transhistorically fixed. That is, it is always, or there is always, a certain sliding of meaning, always a margin not yet encapsulated in language and meaning, always something about race left unsaid, always someone, a constitutive outside, whose very existence the identity of race depends on, and which is absolutely destined to return from its expelled and abjected position outside the signifying field to trouble the dreams of those who are comfortable inside. So Appia is certainly correct to point out two things. First, that as Du Bois himself observed, this move to common history, common disaster, and long memory tends to make the concept of race as a signifier slip and slide, exactly as my title suggests. For as Du Bois acknowledges, this social heritage that binds people together extends, he observes, through Yellow Asia and into the South Seas. Just forget for a moment the language. Just think of what Du Bois is trying to say. What he says is, what makes all these people one is something which crosses the normal geographical boundaries, which crosses the normal racially inscribed divisions, and therefore it cannot, as it were, be held to be internally essential to and necessary to the definition of what constitutes a race. And he adds, and it's a perplexing notion, that it's this unity, common heritage, common language, common disaster, long memory, it's this unity, he says, which crosses the boundaries into Yellow Asia and into the South Seas, this unity which draws me back to Africa. Astonishing sentence. Which unity? Which unity is this that we are obliged to ask? For these people certainly don't all look like one another. They certainly don't all come from the same place. They certainly don't all belong to the same racial stock. They certainly probably have never met one another. Well, secondly, Appia remarks, if obvious things like grosser differences of color, skin, and bone are of little meaning, then he wonders why Du Bois mentions them at all. And he says, the fact that he continues to mention them marks on the surface of his argument the extent to which he cannot quite escape the appeal of the earlier biological or genetic definition of race. Or to put it more generally, as I would, the fact is that the biological, the physiological, and the genetic definitions of race remain an active trace not only in Du Bois's thinking, but in our own everyday thinking, even though it may function as if we have already got rid of it. In a brief but bold conclusion, Appia argues, I think this is the drift of what he's saying, that the discursive or socio-historical turn, which he seems up to that point to be recommending us to take in our thinking about race, substitute a social, historical, and cultural understanding of race for a biological or genetic one, he adds the point, the argument, that even this turn is doomed to failure since he feels it can't itself be free of the biological trace. And here he attacks the very discursive notion of race which I'm trying to advance to you. And I quote his attack, under the hegemony of Saussure and the other linguists, we have too easily become accustomed to thinking of meaning as constituted by systems of difference, purely internal to language. Race, we assume, is constructed by metaphor and metonymy. It stands as a signifier for other differences. But this conception of racial discourse, Appia adds, is a structure of discursive oppositions, is one whose realization is at best problematic and at most impossible. He concludes, the truth is that there are no races, and there is nothing in the world that we can do to rescue them from their loss of meaning. A badge, a signifier, no, that we must turn, so is Appia's argument, to the realities of racial difference, to the realities, the concrete structures and realities of racial discrimination as it works itself through society in order to unlock the secret of its meaning. What we miss through our obsession with the structure of concepts is, he argues, simply reality. I better say it again because I can feel the sense of relief that after skirting around through these various discursive structures, we've come to what, after all, we all know about race. It's reality. You can see its effects. You can see it in the faces of the people around you. You can see people pulling their skirts aside as people from another racial group come into the room. You can see the operation of racial discrimination in institutions and so on. What is the need of all this scholarly hullabaloo about race when you can just turn to its reality? After all, why don't we use the evidence of our eyes? If race was such a complicated thing, why would it be so manifestly obvious to everywhere we look? Here, finally, I think at the end of a brilliant intervention by Appia, I find myself parting company. I hope not from you, or at least not yet. I have, of course, no commitment whatsoever to defending race as a concept, least of all in its genetic, biological, or scientific form, as you will see. Nevertheless, I do not understand what is meant by saying that racial discourse conceptualized as a structure of oppositions cannot be realized. Does he mean that it has no purchase on the real world, no real effects out there beyond what he calls the text world of the academy? That because we can't find a scientific referent for race, it doesn't exist? What exactly is the nature of this appeal to a manifest, simple reality? I address this point directly because I believe this is exactly where the more skeptical amongst you may be beginning to think, all right, you might say perhaps race is not, after all, a matter of genetic factors, of biology, of physiological characteristics, of the morphology of the body, not a matter of color, hair, and bone, that chilling threesome that Du Bois frequently quotes. But you may say, can you seriously be claiming that it is simply a signifier, an empty sign, that it is not fixed in its inner nature, that it cannot be secured in its meaning, that it floats in a sea of relational differences? Is that the argument that you're advancing? And isn't it not only wrong, but a trivial, and I hear the word being rustled in the audience, an idealist approach to the brute facts of human history, which after all have disfigured the lives and crippled and constrained the potentialities of literally millions of the world's dispossessed? What trail through history is more literally marked by blood and violence, by the genocide of the Middle Passage, the horrors of plantation servitude, and the hanging tree? A signifier, a discourse? Yes, that is my argument. My case is that the counterposing of the biological to the cultural and finding the biological unfoundable and unfounded, settling for the cultural, as if that could, as it were, reveal the reality within race itself, is an incomplete argument. The full turn has not been made. And the reason is simple. Scholars in the academy, Anthony Appia suggests, have been too reluctant to share with their fellow citizens outside the academy their inescapable conclusions, which are the repudiation of race as a term of difference, which Du Bois couldn't quite bring himself to make. But in my view, they still have to explain why these racial classificatory systems exist at all and how they work, why so much of the history of the human race has been organized within the shadow of these primordial racial binaries, and above all, why everyday action and everyday common sense language and thinking, as well as the systems which organize the distribution of wealth and power and resources and knowledge differentially across society, are in some ways profoundly linked up with the operation of this slippery term. I think these are discursive systems because the interplay between the representation of racial difference, the writing of power, and the production of knowledge is crucial to the way in which they're generated and the way in which they function. And I use the word discursive here to mark the transition theoretically from a more formal understanding of difference to an understanding of how ideas and knowledges of difference organize human practices between individuals. Since we're concerned here not with abstract theoretical critique, but with an attempt to unlock the secrets of the functioning in modern history of racial systems of classification, let me turn to this question of how indeed one sees this functioning around the troubling question of the gross physical differences of color, bone, and hair, which constitute the material substratum, the absolute final common denominator of racial classifying systems. When all the other refinements have been wiped away, there seems to be a sort of irreducible, ineradicable minimum there, the differences which are palpable amongst people, which we call race. Where on earth do they come from if they're simply, as I want to claim, discursive? Broadly speaking, as I understand it, there are really three options here. First, we can hold that the differences of a physiological kind or nature really do provide the basis for classifying human races into families, and once they can be proved to do so, they can adequately be represented in our systems of thought and language. That's a kind of realist position. It really is there, and all we have to do is reflect what is out there in the world adequately in the systems of language and knowledge which we use to conduct investigations into its effects. If not, then the discourse has no foundation in reality. And Gates puts it in his introduction to the book from which I'm quoting: arbitrary constructs, not aspects of reality at all, pseudoscientific, a careless use of language which wills this sense of difference into our formulation. Indeed, he puts it very dramatically, a pernicious act of language. Well, a second possibility is to hold what is sometimes called the purely textual or linguistic position. Race here is autonomous of any system of reference. It can only be tested not against the actual world of human diversity, but within the play of the text, within the play of the differences that we construct in our own language. And I think this is what Appia is doing or thinking about when he refuses what he calls the turn into Saussurean theory and linguistics. But there is a third position. The third position is the one to which I subscribe. There's often a third position, and I often subscribe to it, as it turns out. I don't know what you want to make of that, but there it is. The third position is that there are probably differences of all sorts in the world. The difference is a kind of anomalous existence out there, a kind of random series of all sorts of things in what you call the world. There's no reason to deny this reality or this diversity. I think it's sometimes, not always, what Foucault means when he talks about the extra discursive, but I'm in Goldsmiths, I don't want to to stir up the Foucauldians here. However, it's only when these differences have been organized within language, within discourse, within systems of meaning, that the differences can be said to acquire meaning and become a factor in human culture and regulate conduct. That is the nature of what I'm calling the discursive concept of race. Not that nothing exists of differences, but that what matters are the systems we use to make sense, to make human societies intelligible, the systems we bring to those differences, how we organize those differences into systems of meaning with which, as it were, we can find the world intelligible. And this has nothing to do with denying that, as I say, the audience test, if you looked around, you'd find we did, after all, look somewhat different from one another. What we know about knowledge matters, but it is not accessible to us in a simply foundational way by putting our hands on it. Gates reminds us how, as Nancy Steppen in her book on the idea of race in science and many others have shown, the tropes and metaphors of race have sought a universal and transcending sanction in biological science. Very different matter from finding their biological truth there. Have found a scientific sanction in science, have tried to mystify those tropes scientifically in order to make them natural, absolute, and essential. This is, of course, in my view, true, but my argument is that successive failures to find a foundational basis in science has not prevented successive generations from having another shot at it. Nevertheless, I would argue that this is not because there is some ultimate truth of this kind to be found in science, but for quite another reason. Because since the Renaissance, at least, and especially since the Enlightenment, it is the signifier science that bears the indicator of the truth about what we are saying. What people look for in science is not the truth about race, but the sanction of truth about race. That is to say, of that which will make what they cannot make true in any other way come true as an effect. Science is here not consulted, but invoked. Racially classifying systems themselves have a history, and their modern history seems to emerge where peoples of very different kinds first encounter and have to make sense of peoples of another culture who are significantly different from them, and that we can date when that historical encounter occurred. I want to talk about that at the moment. When the old world first encountered the peoples of the new world, they put to them a question. It's the famous question which Sepulveda put to Las Casas when the subject was debated within the Catholic Church of what is the nature of the peoples that we have found in the New World. Now, they didn't say what I think the religious amongst you would like to hear them say. Oh, well, these are they not men like us and our brothers? Are they not women like us and our sisters? No, they didn't say that. That took a very, very long time to come, about 200 or 300 years before the abolitionist movement thought of putting a question like that. No, what they said is, are these true men? That is to say, do they belong even to the same species that we do? Or are they born of another creation? And here, for centuries, it was not science, but religion. Religion standing as the signifier of knowledge and truth, where the human sciences, and then science itself was later destined to stand, which would ground the truth of human difference and diversity in some fact which was controllable, which could put them over there and us over here, them in the boats and us on top of the civilizations that we had conquered and so on. It is that act of organizing people through their differences into different social groups, which is the act of social and human classification. That is what is being sought, first in a religious discourse, then in an anthropological discourse, and finally in a scientific discourse. Here, each of these knowledges are functioning not as the provision of the truth, but as what makes men and women sleep well in their beds at night. They're kind of soothers. They're knowledge soothers. They're tucking in the soother in the mouth. Yes? First you pop in the religious one, and you hope to find that after all was said and done, God actually created two kinds of men. He had two goes at it, one weekend and then another weekend, and they were over there and we were over here. It's only long afterwards that we happened to stumble across one another, but there's no thought that we both came to the same place. Then that soother doesn't work, you take that out, you pop in another one. And anthropologically they say, well, they're sort of really like us. That's because we all really come from monkeys. But some of them are much closer to monkeys than we are. And although that may not be an absolute difference, this is enough to found differences in university departments, publishing, etc. And then finally, when that doesn't, when anthropology itself finally gives up, along comes James Clifford, and it gives up sort of, this knowledge of what anthropology can do, sort out the sheep from the goats. Then science comes along and says, I can do it. Try genetics. See, you can't see genetics. It's a wonderful internal system. We have the clue to it. We can look at it in the laboratory. But, only human beings can't see. What they see are the effects of the genetic code operating. So it's a wonderfully secret code which only a small number of people have at their disposal, which can do exactly what religion didn't manage to do and anthropology didn't quite bring off. It can tell you why these people do not belong in the same camp, why they are very different from one another, why they really are a different species. And wouldn't it be good to know that instead of, trying to work out, whether the ones who are your friends are sort of closer to you than the ones who are not, all that complicated map of alliances, etc., which constitute human relations, wouldn't it be good if you just had something simple which says, I'll just pop into the lab and I'll tell you whether they are or not. And that's what it'll do. Science has a function, a cultural function in our society. Let me, pause before I get carried away. I'm not suggesting that there's nothing to science. It's not my business today. I'm talking about the function which science performs within human cultural systems. I'm talking about the cultural function of science. And I'm saying that the cultural function of science in the languages and discourses of racism have been to provide precisely that guarantee and certainty of absolute difference which no other systems of knowledge up until that point have been able to provide. And that is why the scientific trace remains such a remarkably powerful instrument in human thinking, not only in the academy, but everywhere in people's ordinary common sense discourse. For centuries, the struggle was to establish a binary distinction between two kinds of people. But what you get to the Enlightenment, which says or recognizes everybody is one species, then you have to begin to find a way which marks the difference inside this species. It's now not two species, but why one bit of the species is different, more barbarous, more backward, more civilized than another part. And you get into a different marking of difference, the difference that is marked inside the system. Listen to the way in which Edmund Burke once wrote to Robertson in 1877, we need no longer, 1777, we need no longer go to history, he said, to trace the knowledge of human nature in all its stages and periods. Why? Because now the great map of mankind is unrolled all at once, and there's no state or gradation of barbarism and no mode of refinement which we do not have at the same instant under our view. That is the panoptic glance of the Enlightenment. Everything, all of human creation, is now, as it were, under the eye of science. And within that can be marked the differences that very much matter. And what are they? The very different civility of Europe and of China, the barbarism of Tartary and of Arabia, and the savage state of North America and New Zealand. The point I'm making is that it is not science as such, but whatever is in the discourse of a culture which grounds the truth about human diversity, which unlocks the secret of the relations between nature and culture, which unties the puzzling fact of human difference, which matters. What matters is not that they contain the scientific truth about difference, but that they function foundationally in the discourse of racial difference. They fix and secure what else otherwise cannot be fixed or secured. They warrant and guarantee the truth of differences which they discursively construct. Indeed, we can make the same point about science itself, since the science on which the 19th century discourses of race were grounded functioned very differently from that which was later invoked in what came to be called scientific racism in the latter years of the 19th and the early years of the 20th century. The relationship here, then, is that culture is made to follow on from nature, to lean on it for its justification. Exactly, nature and culture here operate as metaphors for one another. They operate metonymically. It is the function of the discourse and of race as a signifier to make these two systems, nature and culture, correspond with one another in such a way that it is possible to read off the one against the other, so that once you know where the person fits in the classification of natural human races, you can infer from that what they're likely to think, what they're likely to feel, what they're likely to produce, the aesthetic quality of their productions, and so on. It is constituting a system of equivalences between nature and culture, which is the function of race as a signifier. David Green once remarked in his essay on classified subjects, writing on anthropology and photography, on the way, though never immune to the white man's burden, in which anthropology was gradually, he says, drawn through the course of the 19th century to move towards a causal connection between race and culture. As the position and status of the inferior races came increasingly to be regarded as fixed, so-called socio-cultural differences came to be regarded as dependent more and more upon hereditary characteristics. And since these were inaccessible to direct observation, they had to be inferred from physical and behavioral traits, which in turn they were intended to explain. Sociocultural differences among human populations, he says, became subsumed within the identity of the human body itself. In an attempt to trace the line of distinction between the biological and the social, it is the body which became the totemic object, the very visibility of the evident articulation or linkage between nature and culture. And I want to return to this question of visibility in a moment as I conclude. The point then is not about how racial differences actually function in nature, but how the discourses of race function in culture exactly as they were supposed to do, that is to say, exactly as they were supposed to function naturally. And what is the point of their functioning naturally? It is that they can be beyond the reach of change, of culture and history, to rework them or to recompense and reconstruct them. That is to say, the work of science here establishes a kind of chain of equivalences from which race has never been able to free or divest itself. We're looking here, therefore, not at nature, but what has been called the naturalization effect, which is a very different thing, reconstituting social and cultural differences as if they functioned naturally, as if they functioned according to the logic of nature. And this is a way, as it were, of invoking nature, which makes those distinctions which are drawn in the interactions between human groups more unmovable, more fixed, more transhistorical, more unopen and closed to change and resistance. It is not that the differences are scientifically explicable, but that they're constructed as scientific because that is the foundational language in which their truth claims can be made to stick. And that is one reason why what I've called the biological trace is, in my view, unlikely to disappear entirely from the discourses of racial difference, even though the foundational value of biology and genetics in our talk about race has been radically weakened. The biological trace, in my view, as a discursive system is required so long as this essentializing, naturalizing function, this way of, as it were, taking racial difference out of history, out of culture, and locating it, as it were, beyond the reach of change, so long as that function is part of what racial systems are about. However, this is not the only reason, in my view, why biological reasoning, while functioning, as it were, as if it's largely untrue, but still somehow hangs around in the conversation which we conduct around race, that's not the only reason why that is so. What Du Bois started with, and what Appiah argues he couldn't quite disassociate himself from, despite all the problems that it produced in his language, was precisely the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone, which, despite the fact that they remain anomalous to actual populations, that they transcend scientific definition, they are what finally, when we come down to it, provides the foundation for the languages of race that we speak every day, the stubborn, gross, physical facts of color, hair, or bone. Now, the central fact about these gross physical differences is not, of course, that they are based on genetic differentiation, but that they are clearly visible to the eye, as Appiah said, not only of the historian, but of the sociologist. They're visible indeed to everybody's eye. They're absolutely and obviously and uncontrovertibly there. They are the visible difference. They are what it palpably, to the untutored, unscientific eye, makes race a thing we can continue to talk about. They are, in a sense, beyond dispute. They put race beyond dispute. They are brute, physical, biological facts about human vision that appear in the field of vision, where seeing is believing. They connote, of course, what, in fact, if we think about it, cannot be seen but has to be inferred. But let me come on to that in a moment. When Frantz Fanon in Black Skin, White Masks, who, as you know, was transfixed by this inscription of racial difference on the surface of the black body itself, what he called the dark and unarguable evidence of his own blackness. I am the slave, he said, not of an idea that others have of me, but of my own appearance. I am fixed by it. Well, what indeed, of course, what can people be transfixed by other than that which is so palpably, evidentially, concrete, undeniable there? A racial difference which writes itself indelibly on the script of the body. And yet I want to argue even here that the play of its signifiers are at work. What gives rise to these evident and visible signs of racial difference, fuzzy hair, big noses, thick lips, large behinds, and as the French writer Michel Cournot once delicately put it, penises as big as cathedrals? What gives rise to all that is, of course, the genetic code. I mean, it's not just that those things are there, because I don't know whether you've ever, really conducted the experiment and tried to actually sort out a palpable group of people who contain some of these differences, carefully and discreetly into two opposing groups. It just simply can't be done. Just simply can't be done. You can get some people over there and a few people over there, and then there are all those wishy-washy things in the middle that keep slipping and sliding from inside to outside. It's just not possible quite to fix it. So actually, though race is clearly what you can see, what fixes it is because we all know, we scientific folks, that behind these is the genetic code, which regrettably you can't see, but which you can infer from the fact that some people have large behinds, and some people have fuzzy hair, and some people have big noses, and some people, for all I know, have penises as big as a cathedral. But, you can't set about organizing the population. You can't say, drop your pants and I'll tell you whether you're this or that, because the thing is just too anomalous for that. But you can be sure that genetically some code has actually given, at the level of the surface of appearances, these differences. And we poor mortals have to work with this, confusing surface of appearances because we can't get access to the genetic code. Well, this is quite true, but I'm afraid what you're saying, what you're telling me, is that actually these things which you can see are also signifiers. You are reading them as signs of a code which you can't see. You assume that it's the genetic code that produces these gross differences of color, hair, and bone. And only because of that can you use that as the way of distinguishing between one group of people and another. If I said, well, it just happened by chance, that's not the answer we're looking for. We're looking for the fact that you can read the body as a text. It is a text. Now, my friends, I know you will say, if you hit me, if you cut me, I bleed. If you run over me in the street, as is frequently the case in front of, in the New Cross, I'll be flattened. You can't tell me it's a text. It may be, but as insofar as what we are talking about are the systems of classifying difference, the body is a text, and we are all readers of it. And we go around looking at this text, inspecting it like literary critics, closer and closer, for those very fine differences, those subtle differences of metaphor. And then when that doesn't work, we start to run like a true structuralist. We start to run the combinations. Well, if I perm, not so big nose with rather fuzzy hair, and and sort of largish behind, and goodness knows what, I might sort of come out with a kind of approximation. We are readers of race. That's what we're doing. We are readers of social difference. And the body hair, which is cited as if this is what terminates the argument. When you say race is a signifier, no, it's not. See the folks out there, they're different. You can tell they're different. Well, that very obviousness, the very obviousness of the visibility of race is what persuades me that it functions because it is signifying something. It is a text which we can read. Now, this notion that even the genetic code then is only imprinted on us, as it were, through the body, rather than on the body, that you can't stop at the surface of the black body itself, as if that, well, I was going to say, as if that brought the argument to a close, but that is exactly why the body is invoked in the discourse in that way, in the hope that it will bring the argument to a close. That if you invoke reality itself, if you say to the blackest person in the room, step this way, somehow pointing to him or her will destroy all my argument. Just look there. That is exactly what the function of invoking the body, as if it is the ultimate transcendental signifier, as if this is, the marker beyond which all argument will stop, all language will cease, all discourse will fall away before this reality. And I'm afraid I think that this is what lay at the end of Appio's injunction to us, to just turn to the reality of race. I think we can't turn to the reality of race, because the reality of race itself is what is standing in the way of our understanding, in a profound way, what the meaning is of saying that race is a cultural system. Well, if I'm right, and the question of what can and cannot be shown to be the case scientifically has only a very indirect bearing on how racial discourses actually work in a broad historical way, or indeed how difficult it might be to make a move to reject this biological physical level, you will see that the problem that I have in moving beyond the biological definition of race is not at all because I want to preserve it, but because I want to understand the function which it performs in the discourse of racial difference. I prefer Du Bois's formulation in a book that he wrote called The Dusk of Dawn, Common History, Suffered a Common Disaster, Have One Long Memory, The Social Heritage of Slavery, Color as a Badge, that is, race as it is read and reread as a signifier in human culture. Even though this way of thinking about it can't do the work that Du Bois wished it to do, any more than it can do the work that the biologist or the geneticist or indeed the racist wishes it to do, it cannot ground an absolute difference between the races. It cannot provide the natural basis for the tie which Du Bois feels for Africa. It does move the argument decisively onto socio-historical terrain. The problem then is that once it is set on this terrain and has been decisively renounced in its biological form, we are inevitably, where race is concerned, in very uncertain, open-ended, contested terrain. We cannot, from either side of the political spectrum, then invoke the certainty of race as a way of guaranteeing the truth of whatever it is we are saying. And this is an uncomfortable truth. It's an uncomfortable truth, of course, for those who would have liked to be able to invoke the biological or genetic trace as a way of stopping the argument. But it is also a very difficult truth to come to terms with amongst those people who feel that, as it were, the reality of race gives a kind of guarantee or underpinning to their political arguments and their aesthetic judgments and their social and cultural beliefs. It isn't, as I've said, that biology doesn't exist, that it's pure falsification. It isn't that there aren't any biological characteristics in different populations. It is that this level cannot do what in the end it is required by the discourse of race to do. It can't establish differences between races and families of races that is beyond the reach of human history and its capacity to change. However, because these differences are indeed gross and obvious, that has had real and palpable effects, and they have been used to perform again and again a particular kind of work in the knowledge which we have about human difference in our own society. In one way, then, Appiah, was right. Though race cannot perform the function that it was asked to do by providing the truth and fixing that truth beyond the shadow of a doubt, it is difficult to get rid of because it is so difficult in the languages of race to do without some kind of foundational guarantee. And the point that I'm making there about the necessity of a foundational guarantee is not a theoretical argument, or not a theoretical argument only, it is a political argument. Because so much of the politics, both of race and of anti-race, are founded on the notion that somehow, somewhere, either biology or genetics or physiology or color or something other than human history and culture will guarantee the truth and authenticity of the things we believe and want to do. It is the search for that guarantee, as much in the politics of anti-racism as in the politics of racism, which makes us, which addicts us to the preservation of the biological trace. It is hard to give up because, in the end, we don't know what it is like to try to conduct a politics, especially a politics of anti-racism, without a guarantee. We don't know what it is like to conduct a politics without a guarantee. We want somehow to be told something which tells us that the contingent, open-ended, usually wrong political choices we make can in the end be read off against some other more scientific, theoretical template, which if we only had hold of at the beginning would have told us what was right and what was not. We need the guarantee. We need to have in the sleep of reason that which says, yes, do it, because it not only feels right and looks right and is the right thing as far as your calculations can take it, but in the end, it will be right. There is something which will make it right. That is because the people holding it, after all, these are the people these are the good people. How, in the name of people who have come together around this common form of identification, how could they be wrong? But the truth is that, like all ordinary human beings, we could all be wrong, and often are, quite usually are, in fact, in our politics, almost always are, you might say. I mean, the one thing that we are not is guaranteed in the truth of what we do. Indeed, I believe that without that kind of guarantee, we would need to begin again in another space, begin again from a different set of presuppositions to try to ask ourselves, what might it be in human identification, in human practice, in the building of human alliances, which, without the guarantee, without the certainty of religion or science or anthropology or genetics or biology or the appearance of your eyes, without any guarantees at all, might enable us to conduct an ethically responsible human discourse and practice about race in our society? What might it be like to conduct that without having at our backs just the touch of a certainty that even if we look as if we are wrong, if we only had access to the code, something would have told us in the beginning what we should do? In Fanon's book, Black Skin, White Masks, where, as I said, he's entranced and he's obsessed by the trauma of his own appearance and of what it means. He's driven wild by the fact that he is caught and locked in this body which the white other knows just by looking at him. That the other can see through him just by reading the text of the black body. He's obsessed by that fact. And yet, as I'm sure you know, when it came to it, the power and importance of black-skinned white masks is that Fanon understood that beneath what he called the bodily and corporeal schema is another schema, a schema composed of the stories and the anecdotes and the metaphors and the images, which is really, he says, what constructs the relationship between the body and its social and cultural space. These stories, not the fact itself. The fact itself is just exactly that trap of the surface, which allows us to rest with what is obvious. The worst and most difficult point about racism is that it is so manifestly banal. It's so plainly there. I mean, we can argue about what to do about it. Do you like it or don't you? But can you really go on studying it even? You know, one of the first graduate students I ever had wanted to do race in popular fiction in the late 19th and early 20th century. And after she'd read about, 85 books of, Tarzan and, on and on and on, she came to me one day and she said, this is Margaret Marshman, she said, what is there to say? I mean, it's very racist. It's obvious. You don't need a sort of, critical apparatus, a whole scholarly training to discover that there's a sort of touch of racism here. It's manifest, staring you in the face. It's so manifestly there. Well, the trap in racism is precisely to allow what is manifestly there, what offers it to us as its symptom of appearance, to stand in the place of what is in fact one of the most profound and deeply complex of the cultural systems which allow us to make a distinction between inside and outside, between us and them, between who belongs and who doesn't belong. That apparently simple, obvious, and banal fact requires the invocation of territories of knowledge in order to produce it as a simple, obvious, visible fact. In this way, race is more like sexual difference. Racial difference is more like sexual difference than it is like the other systems of difference, precisely because anatomy, physiology, appears to wind the question up. And what we know about and have learned gradually about sexual difference, that is to say, the profundity of the depth that lies behind the making of that distinction, is what we need now to begin to learn about the languages of race which we speak. I once tried to put the argument that I'm offering you in another form. I called it a critique of the idea of an essential black subject, a subject who, as it were, contained the truth within the race or the racial character of himself or herself. And what I said there was, what is at issue here is the recognition of the actual extraordinary diversity of the subjective positions and the social experiences and the cultural identities which now compose the category black. The recognition that black is essentially a politically and culturally constructed category insofar as it has meaning in human systems and insofar as it operates within the play of power. It's one which cannot be grounded in a set of fixed, transcultural, transhistorical social categories. It's one which has no guarantees in nature. And this inevitably entails a weakening or fading of the notion that race, or some composite notion of a race around the term black or color or differences of skin and hair and text, that these differences would either guarantee the effectivity of any cultural practice or determine in the end the rightness or wrongness of a political mobilization. Once you enter the politics of the end of the biological definition of race, you are plunged headlong into the only world we have, the maelstrom of a continuously contingent, unguaranteed political argument, debate, and practice. A critical politics against racism, which is always a politics of criticism. I would, of course, be skeptical for the reasons that that I've quoted. I wouldn't go so far as to say. If I take the point behind what you say, is my mind so closed that differences of this kind can never be genetically shown? I go with the experience that we have that when that is claimed, it almost always is never able to be reduced to a genetic or biological basis alone. So that even if you could go so far as to begin to show what might be the genetic basis of certain of the physiological differences that we're talking about, and I don't deny that those might be so, I don't deny those at all. First of all, the point stands, which I made earlier on, which is that what matters is how we organize and classify those differences into human systems of understanding and practice. That's what matters. So that the very fact of difference itself at a biological or genetic level wouldn't disturb my argument. But even if you could show that the genetic was, as it were, determining behavior or further up the scale than that, not just leading to sort of basic predispositions, but actually beginning to determine behavior itself, I think we could expect to find what we have found in almost all the cases that I know of this kind, which is that those predispositions are always, in human systems, open to infinite variability, that they're always the result of the interaction between genetic disposition and cultural and environmental closure. So that, I don't think it would have to go a very long way before what I have been calling the sort of genetic guarantee could so fix those differences that, as it were, we could measure the language of human difference simply in terms of genetic truth or not. Of course. I'm glad you asked that question, because I think you could have deduced from what I've been saying that we don't need to worry about racism and its effects. We just need to think about the language. That is the exact opposite of what I've been trying to say. Yeah? Of course, the effects of race and racism in operation in human systems has the most profound and have had largely disastrous social and historical effects and consequences. But what I'm arguing is, the question is, how does that work? How does that work? And what I'm arguing is that it works precisely because these are cultural. Now, when you say cultural in Britain, people immediately assume it has something to do with the upper reaches of the mind, the heart, the head. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking precisely about the way in which human meanings constantly organize and regulate human practice. Human practices are regulated by ideas, regulated by images, regulated by meanings. What is distinctive about human behavior is that it is not simply that which results from, a sort of physical impulse of one kind or another, the jerk of the knee, but that it is mediated by meaning. That's all that I mean by the discursive. So, of course, in case anybody who works in the field of race relations thought that I was, consigning you to permanent unemployment. There's everything still to be studied about how the effects of racial practices work out in the society. I was not trying to supplant those extremely important studies and the politics that flow from them by what I was saying. But I was trying to penetrate the kind of secret of what founds the distinction on which those human practices are conducted, what founds the differences which distributes power so regularly and systematically in this binary way. And that is the point at which it seems to me we need to understand how meaning is functioning in race. Whereas the question we're tempted to ask is, how does color, bone, and hair function? Yes? How does our bodies function? How does the genetics function? How does the physiology differentiate? We constantly ask about its functioning the displaced or misplaced question. I was talking about color because it's the aspect of race that preoccupies me most, for obvious reasons, for an obvious and banal reason. But actually, I think if you think about the conceptual structure of my argument, I don't see that it poses a problem. Yeah? Exactly, anti-Semitism tries to make a distinction between groups of people. It tries to use the diversity of human races precisely in a specifically scientific and genetic way. I mean, there is no more acute reader of the text of the body than the anti-Semite. The anti-Semite has more work to do than the anti-black racist, because the texts don't speak as obviously. You really have to look at the nose. You have to find out about the grandparents and their grandparents and where they came from. You have to find out about every drop of blood. You really, really have to work hard to make the biological and the genetic work. But anti-Semitism means for it to work. It means for it to work. And it wants to be guaranteed. Anti-Semitism wants to be guaranteed that not a single person that is wrongly classified has ever been punished for it. And that